Well, at least this works. So you can see this. We're going to talk about, let's see. We're going to talk about economic growth. A number of ways to measure, different ways that people measure economic growth, GDP. We've talked about that there's some drawbacks to GDP, and we're going to talk about different ways today, different ways to measure economic growth and economic development. So that's and so the first thing we'll do is we're going to compare. We'll start by comparing growth and just the overall GDP growth. So what we'll first do is look at GDP growth as measured by the gross domestic product. You've learned from the national accounts data how economists measure gross domestic product. So that is the value of transactions that take place. So based on that, we're going to talk about, we've talked about general levels of GDP around the world. Now we're going to talk about GDP growth rate. And this shows over the period 2000 to 2014, and that's what we'll go over. The average GDP growth rate by continent, and beginning with Africa. And you can see, actually, for much of we've talked about a lot of problems that Africa has had, but actually there are a lot of success stories. Africa has seen a lot of improvements, and no small part, in part to investment and the energy and the minerals that Africa has, and also the impact of China. I think has had an important impact as China has grown. Its need for mineral wealth and also markets for lower price goods have been important, and so Africa has to a fair degree benefited from this. And we may also want to consider what's going to happen with India. We'll be talking a little bit more in some detail in the next several weeks about India. Some very interesting things going on, but let's focus here. You can see some of the highest rates of economic growth in the world, actually, in this century have taken place in African countries. And we can see, for example, here Ethiopia. This is one of the highest growth countries in the world on a on GDP percentage growth rate. That's so you have about a 4% median growth rate. These are about like 10% annual growth rates. Some very impressive. Some of these are very impressive growth rates, and you see it on East Africa. And this is where I think China has had a positive impact. Mozambique, Zambia. We've talked a bit about Zambia. Ethiopia, Uganda, that's Rwanda, and Tanzania. There's Kenya. All of these have had above average growth rates, and some of them quite well above. So these are countries where people are experiencing an increase. So these are some of the significant areas of the world where people are seeing, poor people are seeing an improvement in their living standard. Nigeria has emerged as Africa's biggest economy and is becoming a significant power. There's Ghana. I've talked about Ghana. That's Burkina Faso, which has had a reasonable amount of growth. That's Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone that has recovered from there was a civil war there, but you've seen some countries that have struggled. South Africa is one that has not done as well. Conflict has and poor governance certainly has had an impact here. This is Côte d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast, which has had a lot of political conflict and struggles. Liberia, Guinea and Guinea-Bissau, again, some authoritarian governments. That's a problem with governance. And there is the Gambia, that little country. That's one that the long-running leader was just overthrown. So that may improve there. But you've got a number of these countries that have done reasonably well. That's Chad. That's an interesting. And that's a story I don't understand very well. I haven't heard a lot of good things, but the numbers are good. And these are real GDP growth rates. That's Libya. I think you may know the civil war, the conflict that's going on there. That's the cause there. Central African Republic, kind of the same thing. A lot of political problems. Zimbabwe, again, very poor governance. Repressive government and poor government. So you can kind of picture the countries that are, that's Eritrea, again, authoritarian government, repressive government. That's kind of the problem. Repressive governments in general are not very good places for, in general, there's different stories. China is certainly an exception. Then we don't have data from Angola, that's South Sudan, Somalia. I haven't talked anything about this. Is Western Sahara. This is an area that Morocco claims and controls, but there's been a civil war there. It's a very sparsely populated, very small population, and that's a long-running conflict. Europe is an interesting story, and it's all lots of red, a lot of red, and this is one of the problems that's taken place in the developed world, and you'll see when you talk about, you've heard this talk about Brexit, the election of Donald Trump as president of the United States. One of the things that we'll see, we may talk about it when I talk about inequality, is that there's been increasing inequality in much of the West, in this country as well, but not as much. But certainly very poor growth. One of the things that you'll notice, most of these countries are in the Eurozone. This is also the Eurozone. These countries have performed very, very poorly, and in fact, you can see the Southern Europe. What are called the pigs, including Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain. These countries in particular have done very, very poorly. These are actually, Italy has actually had negative economic growth this century. Actually, its economy has shrunk in the 21st century. Greece is as well after 2008. So these countries are not doing very well, and the Eurozone in general is not doing well. And one of the problems with a single currency is that when you have a single currency in a continent like Europe, that's a lot of variation. You've got a lot of variation in culture, in economies. Some regions can benefit at the expense of others, but in this case, you kind of see that no one's really done very well. Interesting that Belarus, which stands out, is and here's an example. This is the last dictatorship in Europe. This country, it's the last really truly authoritarian government in Europe, and yet it's done. What's his name? Lukashenko is the fellow that the president or autocratic ruler of Belarus, and he's been like 20 years or so. But it seems to be doing okay. Its economic growth rate is okay. There's Ukraine. Ukraine, of course, became independent from Russia. Here's Russia, and Russia is about the global average. Russia's benefited from energy. It has a lot of energy, and so high energy prices were beneficial. The problem in Ukraine really is corruption, and the interesting thing about this country, it's fiercely independent, or at least the Ukrainians. But you also have a problem that this part of the country is actually Russian, ethnic Russian, and most of the people speak Russian here as opposed to Ukrainian. They use the same alphabet. I think it kind of sounds the same, but for them it's very, very different, and certainly they feel a different culture. Culturally, they feel the Ukrainians feel very different from the Russians. They feel more a part of the West than they feel more a part of the West and Central Europe. But they have a lot of corruption, and that's really the problem. Now, one of the interesting things, you may have heard about this bug, or this the cyber attack that seems to have originated from the Ukraine. Not that it originated, but it seems like some people think it was an attack by Russians on Ukraine. That they're trying to damage the Ukrainian economy, and then it's gotten shipped. The software can go everywhere, so it's gone everywhere. But some people think that was an attack by Russian elements that want to destabilize the Ukrainian economy. Interesting, this interesting things go on in the world. The Middle East. We've talked. This is Qatar, and Qatar has been the world's fastest growing economy in this century. And one of the things the tremendous amount of wealth, a very small country with a tremendous amount of wealth, and a feeling of a bit of independence, as you know. What's been going on the last few weeks, that crisis, which seems it's still there. The crisis, there's a blockade. Iran is sending food. Turkey has soldiers there. Turkey has tanks. They have military support. It's a bit of a scary situation. But at any rate, that country has had tremendous growth. Saudi Arabia, probably this has changed the last 2 years because of the drop in oil prices. So this color would not be, it would probably be closer to just being a white color, a lighter color, but certainly during, as a result of high oil prices, the economy has been quite healthy. And otherwise you see that this kind of average growth rate, but then that certainly has changed. That's Syria. That would have changed. Let's see. And then again you can see, I can talk about these this is all oil driven growth. Azerbaijan, oil, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. There's certainly natural, and Tajikistan there. So that's certainly been an impact. I think Afghanistan, its positive growth rate is just the West has been, particularly the United States, has spent a lot of money on the war, on fighting the Taliban, on this endless, silly war that now is almost 20 years of fighting. I think that's all that is. There's nothing particularly positive that's going on in the economy there. So that's one of the things. You can see these growth rates, and so there's a lot of things can be misleading or confusing. But certainly one of the things that we do see is here in Asia, of course, China has been fabulous. This century has seen an astonishing growth of China. There's no way to look, when you look at the numbers, it's just simply startling, incredible. This is probably the greatest surge in terms of the number of people and the amount of wealth that's been created this century. This is the greatest surge of human economic expansion in human history in the last 15 years in China. It's a remarkable story. Of course, there's a lot of problems. The Chinese economy has a lot of problems. There's certainly, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later. I think I might have I need to check that. I don't think that's right. That can't be right. Boy, I just noticed that. That's not right. But why? Oh goodness, that's not. Russia's not right either. Something's wrong here. Something might have. I'm going to have to check that. I'll have to. I just noticed that. Goodness, I'll have to check that and make corrections. That's certainly not true. Japan certainly hasn't, and Russia hasn't. But these are Vietnam. Certainly Thailand. Certainly has grown a lot. Malaysia. Certainly Indonesia. They have certainly grown. East Asia, India is a little bit below. It's grown, but now recent years it's picking up. So India, I think the India story is getting. Boy, that's something is. I got to check this because that comes out red here. Goodness gracious. Well, I'm going to have to check that. That map, something looks wrong there. Because I know the Afghanistan, I think that is Afghanistan there, and that doesn't look correct. That doesn't look right. Any rate, now this just means a little bit below average. That doesn't mean it's negative. It just means it's below average. It have to really, really dark red would mean negative growth, but it means it's just below world average. Again, and this is in terms of real growth, and certainly the U.S. has been very similar. U.S., Canada, Mexico, below average, slow growth in this century. Not very fast. Really, the only that's Panama, and that's kind of we talked a little bit about that. The flow of lots of flow of money and not all of it clean into Panama. So that's flourished, and that's probably part of the reason why. And South America has Brazil has growth has slowed down a lot. Brazil is going through a lot of problems. Brazil is one of those countries that now is experiencing a real crisis because of corruption. They're finding Brazil is actually the world's biggest exporter of beef. It's the world's biggest exporter of beef, and it's become clear there's a corruption scandal in the beef industry that where bribes were paid to the government to have rigorous health inspections. Well, to show how stupid this is, I think that's the right word. They're exporting beef. They're exporting They're exporting beef that is not meeting quality standards. That is clearly has problems. The U.S. has stopped importing beef from Brazil, and the reason is that they had the unsuitable. The testing was showing unsuitable amounts that were 10 times acceptable levels. They were showing more than 10% of the amount of the beef tested was not up to standard, and that's the corruption. This country's going to go major change. This is now they're going to have the people are revolting against this corruption in this country. So that's going to see a lot of change. Of course, Venezuela, if you follow the news, every day gets worse and worse. This is really it's a tragic situation. This should be a wealthy country. This simply should be a wealthy country. It's one of the world's biggest producers of oil. It just simply should be a wealthy country, and what's going through is just astonishing incompetence. There's no other word for it. Peru, see, but you've got these countries going from Colombia down to Bolivia, in these Andean countries, and also Chile, about average, that's a modestly above average economic growth rate. Now I want to talk about, and I think someone in the class mentioned about, someone asked about purchasing power parity. Has anyone asked about that? Someone I know has asked me about what purchasing power parity. And what's interesting about purchasing power parity is it's an effort to try to explain not just when we compute GDP and we compare it across countries, we're doing it at an exchange rate. Okay, we do it at, say, at a country's exchange rate, and we compare that typically with the US dollar in order to compare all countries around the world. The problem is that your exchange rate is, as we've learned, is determined by the value of a country's exports. The exports that a country has determines the value of its currency relative to other currencies. So that's how you determine. That's what makes gives value to a currency is the exports. So what happens to the goods and services that are not exported? That's the that's the issue. And for example, if you've traveled to a third world country or a lesser developed country, has anyone traveled to countries like Thailand, any kind of poor country? If you go there, things are cheap. If you may have heard, if you go to a country like a Thailand or a Vietnam or an Indonesia, you'll find like restaurants are very, very cheap. You'll find typically restaurants or some services, local services are very cheap. And so the reason is that we want to make a comparison. What purchasing power parity (PPP) does, it attempts to calculate the real living standard that people experience within a country. So it's what's the quality of life that they can have with the money that they earn, and when you have a lot of local services are cheaper, that non-traded local goods are actually relatively cheap compared to other parts of the world. So that, for example, if I could go live in Bangkok or Manila, for example, and you can get a Western, high quality apartment at probably 60,000-70,000 yen a month. I mean, that would be like 100 square meter apartment in a high quality area. It's cheap. You can live for cheap there. So what's done, it's adjusting the currency rate between countries to reflect the differences in prices for goods commonly consumed across countries. And so there's the stated currency exchange rate is called the nominal exchange rate, and purchasing power parity then adjusts the exchange rate, and it's called the real PPP-based exchange rate. So the adjusted real exchange rate, the relative prices of comparable baskets of goods sold in the two countries are the same. So you're taking if I buy the same basket of goods in Thailand compared to the US, how much Thai baht do I need to have to be able to buy the same goods as in the United States or Japan? So if I can buy the same goods, and what is the price? What's the price to buy the same goods? And typically, if it's a country like a Thailand or an Indonesia or an Vietnam, it's lower. And so you adjust that up. So actually the country, in terms of purchasing power, it's wealthier than it appears from the GDP figures. So that's what we're doing here. And so that's, as it states here, PPP adjusted national output per person is lower in countries with nominally higher levels of per capita income and higher in countries with nominally lower levels of per capita national income. And it has to do with something called the Balassa-Samuelson theory, named for a Hungarian economist, Balassa, and American economist Paul Samuelson, that productivity varies more across goods traded internationally than across goods that do not trade. So that they've come up with that you don't need to worry about that unless you're particularly. We can go over it just so that you can understand it. But it's basically that you have non-traded good produced in country one and non-traded good produced in country two. Usually, typically, if they think of it like restaurants. You go to a restaurant. You can't export a local restaurant. You have to go to the local restaurant in order to buy. Or if it's, say, locally produced vegetables or fruit, these may not be. These are non-traded. Think about goods that are not traded, and not exported or imported. And then think about traded goods produced in country one and country two. So let's say that the goods are produced by workers in each country, and that the productivity of workers in the non-traded goods sector in each measure is measured by their relative marginal productivity of labor. Now I know I sent you actually, if you look at the notes that I sent you from microeconomics, I talk about the marginal productivity of labor. Have you taken micro yet? Okay. No, one of the so this might be a little bit above your level, but let me try to explain. Marginal productivity of labor means as you add an additional worker, how much more output does a firm produce? So if I have a company, I have 1,000 workers, and they produce a certain amount. If I add another worker, how much more output is there? That's the marginal productivity of labor. So if we, let's normalize. So what we're going to do is just to make the marginal productivity of labor in the two countries, just make it the same. So that in the non-traded sector, they're the same. And one of the things you'll learn when you take microeconomics is that workers are paid. They're paid their what's called marginal revenue product. So if you add a worker, what's the extra work that the extra goods that they produce, and then what is the price of that good? That's what you can pay them. That's what you can pay the worker. Like, think if you go to work for a company. Let's say you go to work at a convenience store. What do they pay you? They're going to pay you the most they can pay you is the additional revenue that you help produce. That's the most they can pay you. That is your marginal product. That's your marginal revenue product of labor. So that's what we're talking about here, is when you add a worker, how much more revenue can the firm earn from adding that worker? So what we have is that's the wages, the wages in the two countries, and this NT means non-traded. So the non-traded, and we're just going to make it the price of the good, the price of the goods in each country. And then, so the wages are the marginal revenue product times the marginal product of labor. You'll learn this in microeconomics, but just the way to think about it, again, think about working at a convenience store, and you're going to be paid the amount of extra money that you bring to the firm. So that's the idea here. So the price of the traded good is the same across the two. Then we're going to talk about, this is the traded good. So these are the traded goods, and so we're assuming that in one country that they're more productive. So we assume in one country it's more productive than in country one. So the result is, but in this model, wages are equal across the sectors. So you're assuming households, all the households are the same. So that whether you work in the traded or non-traded wage sector, you have to be paid the same wage. But basically, what it shows is, with this example, that the price of the non-traded good in the country with the greater productivity, which tends to be the wealthier country, is higher. So that means that the prices of non-traded goods, theoretically, what this is showing, if you make these assumptions, that theoretically it should make sense that the more that a country that is wealthier, it's wealthier because it's more productive in its traded good. Germany is wealthy because it's very productive in its manufacturing. It exports a lot of manufactured products. Japan is a wealthy country because it's very productive in its manufactured products. And because of that, also its service prices, the price of its non-traded goods, are higher than in a country like a Thailand, which has lower productivity. And that explains why. So at least the point here is that you can at least get an understanding as to why prices, the prices of non-traded goods, say in a developing country as opposed to a developing country, are lower. And it's because there's a lower productivity in the traded good in the developing country compared to a wealthier, more productive country. So now we can look at that and see, well, how does that? Let me see if what you'd want to do ultimately. Yeah, I do make the comparison here. First, I'm going to show Africa still comes out quite poor. South Africa is a little bit better off. Botswana is okay. Of course, Equatorial Guinea above average. This is per capita PPP, which Libya was a relatively wealthy country. Before the overthrow of Gaddafi, it was an authoritarian country, but they were pretty well off. I think now that they don't have that repressive government, but they don't have much money either. So now what we'll do is we're going to compare and see. This is where you want to see. This is GDP as measured by GDP, and this is as measured by purchasing power parity. Okay, so if it's lighter, the country is wealthier. The people experience a wealth that's greater than it would seem. For example, South Africa, it seems relatively poor, but when you compare it with purchasing power parity, it's just a little bit below the world average. Most of the countries, though, are pretty similar. You can see in Africa, the difference is actually not that much, except for at Botswana. Botswana is certainly different, but otherwise you don't have a lot of differences. Mauritania is a little bit better off. That's an interesting country because I think they have a fair amount of mineral wealth, and it's very small population. It's a very, very small population. So actually, this is kind of an interesting country. It's also considered to be the last country in the world really, which has slavery, human slavery. So anyway, so here is, and this is where we're going to see it. This is the per capita PPP. Norway comes out very, very. Norway, Swiss, Luxembourg. I mean, all of these countries are relatively wealthy. They're well above the world average. Norway, on a purchasing power parity basis, is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. Although I hear alcohol is extremely expensive there, so presumably this would not be for people who need to drink a lot. And I have heard that they do like to drink a lot in Norway. So I don't know. So they taxes are very high on alcohol there. So that beside, it appears to be a very wealthy country. Portugal, on the other hand, appears on European standards is relatively poor, actually. And in Greece is not terribly wealthy. Of course, this is the former Yugoslavia, the country Albania, but also the countries of the former Yugoslavia that are generally lower. There's Moldova. Moldova comes out quite poor, and Ukraine is quite poor. There's Georgia. Georgia comes out, and that's on purchasing power parity. So again, what we'll want to do is, you can see this is the example. Remember when I've talked about how, especially for more developed countries, that when you compare purchasing power, the ability to buy things with the national income, that actually GDP overestimates the relative what people can buy. In other words, one of the reasons why the GDP is high is because the prices are high. So if prices are high, and prices are high because it's productive, and the export industries are productive, which, as we've seen, it raises wages in the non-traded sector. Wages are raised in the non-traded sector. So when you compare that with other countries, you can see that the color is distinctly lighter for many of these countries. Sweden, for example, look at how much of a difference. Finland, not so much countries like Russia though, but you'll also see a country like Poland is a little bit more wealthier. So Poland's an example of the other way. Romania comes out a little bit above average, even though it's below average if you measure it by GDP. But by purchasing power parity, it comes out a little bit above average. So those are, and again, same thing with Bulgaria. Bulgaria, the Baltics are not quite as poor. They're the Baltic country, not the Baltic, the Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, these countries. I'm not Baltic. The Baltics are up here, but Turkey comes out pretty much the same. Ukraine not so bad. So Ukraine is not so. Belarus comes out a lot better. So this will tell you that the prices of non-traded goods in these countries are very low. So when the non-traded goods are very low, the colors are going to be lighter or more blue. And you can see for most of the European countries how much it's going to be lighter red or blue, but for the wealthy countries it becomes these colors become lighter. That is, they're not as well. They're really not as wealthy when you compare it with across the world. And again, this per capita income You can see the PPP, the Gulf, very, very high. These are very wealthy. So this is PPP, very, very wealthy countries. All of these oil-rich Persian Gulf countries. What's interesting, Iran comes out a little bit above average. Iran comes out above average, and it kind of this is one of the things that tells me that if Iran becomes more accepted if they can trade more, if the country opens up to the world, that it would be a much wealthier country. And you can see the Central Asian former Soviet republics come out quite poor, except for Kazakhstan, which is above average. Kazakhstan's above average. Remember, it has a lot of Russians. There's a lot of Russian people, the ethnic Russians that live in Kazakhstan, and it's wealthy, and it's not as repressive. It's not as repressive a government as some of these other Central Asian countries. And to compare, it's an interesting. You can see actually it becomes Saudi Arabia becomes wealthier, Oman becomes wealthier. United Arab Emirates, all of them become, well, in fact, much of this part of the world, Iran goes from below average to above average. Iraq goes below average to average. Syria, of course, we don't have data. Jordan, less poor. Egypt, a little bit below average, but not that much. Turkey becomes a little bit above world average. So you can see in general for these Middle Eastern countries, then you have a country like Yemen, but it's still quite poor. So you can see that's the impact. But what's interesting here is that these countries, some of these countries, they're better off, even though they're traded, they're very wealthy. They're very wealthy countries. So that's an interesting comparison. And here, per capita GDP, we can see Japan and Korea, of course, are higher. India much lower. China, of course, coming up. But that's in PPP, and we can see China not so much. You can see the effect of Japan. And that's because prices are still relatively high. The prices of of non-traded goods in Japan are relatively, and perhaps part of this is that, say for food, one of the problems in this country is that, say for food, so much food is imported. So much food has to be imported, and it has to be imported at world prices. So if you're importing wheat prices are high, and of course are kept artificially high in this country. So that's probably part of this. That local products are relatively high, not as much as it used to be. Certainly when I came here 25 years ago to this country, prices for normal goods were incredibly expensive. So the normal goods have actually dropped a lot. But even so, it's still relatively expensive. You can see China not so much. It doesn't get that much lighter. India actually doesn't get that much lighter. Malaysia gets a little bit darker blue. Malaysia does. Thailand does. And it's because they produce so much food. Thailand's a very, very rich country agriculturally. It's the biggest exporter of rice in the world. If you've traveled anywhere around Thailand at all, you'll see rice, enormous amounts of rice that are produced in the country. So there's a lot of food. Food, for example, is very inexpensive in Thailand. And you can see Indonesia is lighter. I mentioned Malaysia. Malaysia is is a little bit darker blue above average. But the interesting thing, India doesn't come out as being that much different, and I find that interesting. That and I think that tells us that prices in India, at least so until recently, have you've got some. It might have to do that goods aren't really traded. There may not be a lot of trade between states in India. Until recently, Indian states are almost like separate countries. They've been traditionally almost like separate countries. People don't really migrate much between states. They migrate more within the states. I think there's not a lot of trade between states. It's a curious country, but changing a lot. Enormous changes going on. If you read the what's going on in India, it's almost something new and interesting and very dramatic going on every day. Every day now you're reading. You're now having the tax. You've had the currency. They've changed all the currency in order to try to reduce corruption. They're changing the tax structure in order to improve tax collection so they can afford to build infrastructure. A lot of. So I think we're going to begin to see some changes in that. Australia actually comes. It's a little bit above, but here's a difference. You can see this is a big difference. And if you've ever traveled to Australia, I've been there once. The prices are ridiculous. They're just absolutely ridiculous. The service is terrible too, but the prices are you go to a restaurant and you're like, what? It's and don't ever change money there. That's also never change money in Australia. Change all your money before you go, and if you try to exchange money, you'll have a terribly unpleasant surprise. But that's it's very expensive. The country is very, very expensive. So even for local goods, it's a very expensive country. So it looks very wealthy. It looks extremely wealthy, but it's it's actually less wealthy in terms of what people can actually buy with their money. So that's the thing with purchasing power parity. This is an example. That's quite a big difference. It's one of the world's richest countries in terms of per capita income. But when you compare on PBP, it's just a bit above average. It's above average definitely, but that's a big difference in color. You see, and to a similar extent in New Zealand as well. So you can see that these countries end up different. Now here's interesting because the U.S. ends up quite well off. The U.S. is well off. Again, this is PPP. So this is purchasing power parity. The United States is wealthier than Canada, and I think you see that? You see again, they're about the same in terms of per capita GDP, but Canada is lower. Taxes are higher, prices of goods are higher in Canada. So that even though and for example, if many Canadians live near the U.S. border, so when you're in a Canadian city, a lot of times people will cross the border to shop in the United States, and that's certainly true in a place like Vancouver. For example, Vancouver is a great example of that. People will go south of, they'll travel to the United States just to go shopping for groceries, gasoline, that type of thing. What's interesting here is how dark these come out. Cuba's interesting though. You see that Cuba. That's a rather curious is a rather curious country. It does come out as medical. It has a very good medical system. Medical care system is very good. That was one of the things they emphasized. And it's probably kept, the regime is authoritarian regime, but probably one of the reasons why the regime has survived for as long as it has is because they have a very, very high quality. The average person get a very high quality of medical care in that country. That's one thing that they put a lot of emphasis. And so when you compare with medical care, actually, people in Cuba are not, it's not as poor a country as it seems. So that's the kind of, you look country by country and you can see these kinds of differences. Yeah, we don't have for Argentina. I think the reason is that Argentina doesn't want to hasn't really been publishing prices. It's hard to get real prices. You can see Chile is a little bit above a global average. Uruguay is a fairly PBP, a fairly wealthy country. Brazil about world average, but you can see these Andean countries are below world average. And in general, it's not that different. Not the differences are not that. It's not that big of a difference in South America. And that's the interesting thing. Sometimes you'll see that very sharp, like we saw that in Europe. We saw it in a number of countries in Asia. We certainly saw it in places like Australia, New Zealand. But other parts of the world, you don't see it as much. And the Ecuador a bit. But not as much. Now we're going to talk about economic development measures, because there's a lot of ways to measure economic wealth. We can talk about money or what you can buy, but there's other measures as well, and we're going to go through these. And one of them is access to water. Not everyone in the world has access to clean water. And this is really a major issue. This is one of the ways you can tell a country that is underdeveloped, is the access to water. The global average, that's to improve water means some access. It doesn't mean you can go turn a tap on. It might mean that a truck comes with clean water. In a lot of parts of rural places in developing countries, if they have access to clean water, the trucks, trucks would also provide that. It doesn't mean that you necessarily just turn your tap on. But in many of these countries, they don't have access to clean water. This is a really, when it's very low, like Angola, Chad, Somalia, Mozambique. Now I've talked that the economies are improving, but still people lack access to some very basic. These are some very low. These are well below average, and some of these numbers are quite low. I think some of these are like 10%. The lowest are down where most of the population does not have access to clean water. That's something that we take for granted here. Now, certainly when you turn on if you have Tokyo City water like I do, you turn your tap on and we filter it because it's especially in the summer now, it has a lot of you can really smell the chlorine, but it is clean. And it's real easy to get other types of clean water, so bottled water and all. So we have that access, but there's a big area of Africa that just does not. And you can almost see the wealthier countries. That's Botswana. Botswana is relatively reasonably wealthy. Gabon, talked about Gabon. And there's an example. This tells you this is Equatorial Guinea, and this is where you have above average economic The economy is above average, but most of the people don't have access to water, clean water. But it's on average, it's very wealthy. But most people don't have access to clean water. That tells you that it's very unequal. There's the distribution of income is very unequal. But you can see Southern Africa in general is better infrastructure. The effect of colonialism was longer. South Africa, of course, has a lot of white people, still has a lot of white people. Botswana is a relatively wealthy country. Namibia is reasonably wealthy. So most people have access to clean water. This is Ghana. Ghana, that tells you, and that's just a little bit below world, that's 90% of the population. Almost 90% of the population in that country have access to clean water. So you can see that's better than a lot of Africa, a lot of the rest of the continent. But you can see that's a great example of Africa lagging. Of course, that's Europe. It's basically 100%. These are all 100%. Everybody. Ireland a little bit less, probably for the rural areas. That's Moldova. They don't quite. That's an interesting. You can see how different. Ukraine a little bit. Let's not. There are people that don't have access to clean water in a country like Ukraine. But basically, this is 100%. All of these countries. All of these countries. These, of course, a little bit under 100%. Still in the 90s, because as I say, the white is 91%. You didn't mention Egypt, but Egypt is clean water. Israel, not surprising. You can see the difference. Palestine, how much lower. A lot of people don't have access to water in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So that's clearly. That shows a problem there. Turkey is quite high. It's almost a Western country in many ways in terms of that. This tells you it's not quite 100%, which is interesting because it might be some people that live out in the desert and they might have local, maybe they get it from wells. And it just may be the natural water. That might be what's going on here. The Persian Gulf is pretty close to 100%. This is just the kind of infrastructure problems in Iraq and Syria. But this kind of can help you point out where problems are. Where problems are. Actually, China is less than 100%. India, interesting, is above average, and we say that's 91%. So more than 90% of the people in India have access to clean water. Southeast Asia, very high, quite high. Of course, Japan is 100%. I think that this is the one place North Koreans have clean water. I don't know if they have access to anything else. They may not have access to a lot of food, but certainly whether they can eat or not, they do have clean water there. Which is interesting because South Korea is not 100%. Indonesia is a little bit below average, but generally Southeast Asia, except for this poor Laos and Myanmar, are relatively high. That's Afghanistan. It's one of the lowest in the world. I think it's just about the lowest in the world. I think that one might be even under 10% of people have access to clean water. Not surprising, Australia, New Zealand, 100%. Papua New Guinea, very few. But I think it rains a lot. They probably just collect. They probably just collect rainwater. So improved water means that there's some processing. That's kind of not. For some reason, the U.S. doesn't quite come out at 100%. I can't quite figure that out. And it may be that it's just local supplies of water. South America in general, most of these countries are access to water is high, but the Andean countries a little bit below average. Remember, these are poor. These countries are poor. This band, right, the area right here, are relatively poor, and that's a reflection of their relative poverty. Sanitation access, this is access to sewage, to sewage services. This is again, Africa in general comes out very poor. There's not access to sanitation. The North African countries are. The Arab countries here in the north are almost European levels of access. But much of Africa, that's not the case. A little bit below average and this is the mean is 67.5%. So this is very interesting. That this tells you a lot of the world, people do not have access to sanitation, sewage and sanitation services. So this has certainly an impact on disease and human health. So this certainly, when you're talking about underdevelopment, this is an important part of what makes a country lesser developed. Is that lack of access. So this is the average, 67.5%, which means a lot of people don't. And then this is what these countries are well below average. Of course, Europe, close to 100%, at or near 100% for most of these countries. Ireland a little bit lower. That's Romania, Moldova. That's Russia. Remember, that's a part of, that little piece is actually part of Russia. So that's what that little lighter spot. That could be the same as these countries, but it averages out for Russia. We don't know. Otherwise, it's pretty much everybody. Most of these countries, most people have access to sanitation. The Middle East, it's high, but not 100%. Of course, countries like Saudi Arabia still have. There's people out in the desert that are living lives that are relatively separate. And that's probably also the case in Oman. Here, of course, this is a poor country. Yemen's a poor country, and they're getting poorer from the civil war. This is just the wars that have gone on. That's the cause of this situation here. Let's see. India, China is becoming more of a not quite a first world country, but certainly that would have been a dramatic improvement. It's interesting that Thailand and Malaysia is actually feels like if you've ever traveled to Malaysia, it feels fairly developed. Thailand, most of it, there's parts of Thailand that you can feel it's poor. But it's pretty well developed, and part of it is a country like Thailand. A big percentage of the population lives in Bangkok, in the metropolitan Bangkok, so they can provide those services there. Here's the big India, though. This is a huge population that's well below average. It's not among the poorest. It's not the poorest country in the world, but when you're talking about 1.3 billion people. 1.4 billion people. This is a lot of people that don't have access to sanitation. This is one of the things that's going to change in this country. This is one of the things, the infrastructure that India needs to construct is access to sewage and sanitation. That's not surprising. These aren't surprising. I actually don't have figures for New Zealand. That's not surprising for North America. There's Haiti, staggeringly poor country, just a horribly poor country. It's that's an example of how poor. You see these countries certainly average or below average, but Haiti is truly very, very, I think the word wretched. It's a wretchedly poor country in a part of the world that really is that are surrounded by places that are much better off. That's Bolivia. Bolivia has the highest percentage of native Native Americans. The people are, it's the largest population in South America that are descended from the people that lived before the Europeans came. And so this is an example of a disparity, of income disparity and income inequality in a country like that. This is in general is a little bit lower through this area. So the southern part you can see is higher. Of course, Chile, this is an example. Chile is quite highly developed, and in many ways the most developed country in South America. So that's an important measure. And now the next one, very important measure of medical expenses. Now, one of the things about medical expenses is this is what you spend on medicine, on medical services, which may or may not be the same thing as quality of care. However, they're going to be correlated. They're going to be similar. And I say that because the country that I'm from, the United States, spends an awful lot of money on medical care, and yet the results are much lower. Whereas this country spends less on medical care and gets a better outcome. So it's, and I think the United States wastes a lot. Some of it is just wasted through the way that medical care is done in that country, and part of it is also the price of drugs is higher in the United States. And in this way, per capita, this is per capita PPP. So this is when you adjust for local prices. This just tells you a lot of Africa. There's no medical care. Throughout most of this area, people may never they may see a doctor only once or twice in their life. They may see a doctor for immunization. They'll come and immunize children for diseases like polio, smallpox, those types of diseases. But these are countries in which there may be, to give an example, Tokyo, 23 wards is a population of 9 million. If you had, for some of these countries, have one doctor for 40,000 people, so that would be like if Tokyo had 2,000 doctors. If you can imagine 9 million people and 2,000, they're not going to. Nobody's going to see doctor. Let's see, is that right? 2,000, 1 for 40,000, 10 for 400,000, 10 for 100 for 4 million. No, 200 doctors, not 2,000, 200. That would be if the 23 wards with 9.4 million people had 200 doctors. That's the level. That's in many. That's kind of what you have in many. Try to imagine that. That's these. Like I say, there's it's something we can't imagine living where we live. And so this is an example. This huge swath of the world still. And that is the expenditure, 1,066. That's the global average. You can see it's the whole continent is below, except for here. And again, all of that gets spent on just a few people. All of that gets spent on just a few people. South Africa, it's probably because there's a lot of white people, and so this is the expenditure for the white people in South Africa. You can see Europe, generally quite high. Swiss, but here's part of Swiss spends a lot on medical care, not quite as much as the United States, but they spend a lot. And actually, they have a medical system that's the closest to the United States, and it turns out it's the second most expensive in the world. Okay. Norway spends this is just the wealth. Norway's wealth. They got a lot of money, so why not spend on healthcare? Luxembourg is the same. But these are generally, the expenditures are relatively high. And certainly expenditures on medical care is a good measure of the relative wealth of a country. You can see Ukraine well below. That's an example. Ukraine, Moldova, well below average. Well below. And this is PPP. So this is PPP. This is adjusted for local prices. The local prices of medical services. Now, one of the problems is, of course, drugs are a traded good. Drugs are traded. So if you're you have to pay world prices to buy drugs. And drugs are an important part of medical care, modern medical care. Drugs are an important part. So this is where, even with PPP, with drugs at world prices, poorer countries have a lot lower quality of medical care. That's one area where poorer countries are relatively poor. What's interesting here is that for medical services is not quite as high. And what's interesting is that there's one of the reasons is that see, these countries, many of the people live in these countries are guest workers, you know, so they're not spending a lot on medical care for these people. You know, so that's why these colors are lighter. You would think these are some of the wealthiest countries in the world, and why are they lighter in terms of medical expenditure? It's because so many of the people that live there are guest workers, and they probably don't have as good medical care. Asia per capita PPP, you can see the difference. Japan and Korea to a lesser extent, a lot lower expenditure. So this is an area that it's interesting that medical care is lower. Now, what's interesting about this is you can see Thailand, Malaysia really stand out. You can see Singapore is blue. That's probably about like Japan's color. And Japan this is a country with great medical. In terms of medical care, in terms of the availability, the general availability of medical care, it's really, I'd have to say it's high. I personally, I've had the last few years, 3 or 4 years, I've had surgery twice, minor, not major surgery, but you know it's, but reasonably priced and very, very, very high quality. So that's certainly something, and you can see how it really does. It does stand out. And I suppose that's interesting, and because what's interesting is that you don't seem to have a lot of medical tourism. At least I don't think a lot of people come from other countries to buy medical services here. I'm not sure, but I mention that because Thailand is different. Thailand, of course, is a country with tourism and a lot of medical tourism. There are some very, very good hospitals in Thailand. If you go to, and I have a hospital that I go to in Bangkok that I've gone to many times, and it's fairly reasonably priced. And very, very high quality. So it attracts a lot of medical tourism, and actually quite a bit of it's from the Middle East. A lot of people wealthy people from the Middle East travel to Thailand for medical services. So that's part of this is so there is a high quality of care, but it's also part of it has to do a little bit because of medical tourism in that country. Australia above average. You can see Indonesia's below average expenditure. The U.S., of course, United States spends more money than any other country in the world on medical care. Can't say that we get my country gets the best outcome, but we do spend the most. As I say, I remember what I mentioned about Cuba. That's above average expenditure. It's not a wealthy country, but they emphasize it, whereas these Central American countries don't, and that makes a difference. These these countries, that means poor outcome. This is, as I say, it's a country that it has a repressive communist government, but it's probably survived because of the quality of its medical care. This is an example unequal. The inequality here, the low expenditure on medical care, it's much less than you would expect, even given the relative wealth, because these countries have an average or above average medical care expenditure, but much lower in those countries. And these countries tend to have native people. So part of it is the gap, the wealth gap between people of European descent and people of Native American descent. I think that's probably part of that. We'll talk a little bit more about inequality. Electricity access is one of the most important things. It's something that we take for granted, is having electricity access, but really electricity is modern, the industrial revolution is really, and the advancement in human well-being is largely because of the harnessing the power of electricity. So electricity access is probably one of the most important things. And here you have, that is 84.6%. You're talking about countries here in Central Africa that just almost zero access to electricity. So you can see for all the problems, the interesting thing here in North Africa, the Arab countries have, everyone has access to electricity. So they're even a country like Egypt, which has an awful lot of problems, but everyone has access to electricity. You see that throughout much of the Middle East. But here, that's quite poor. And you can see the countries that are a little bit better off. Ghana, as an example, some of these South African the countries in South Africa, Nigeria is a little bit better off. Senegal, that's actually Guinea-Bissau, which is not is pretty low, but that's a little bit better off. But many of these countries, very few people have access to electricity. This is one of the ways that these countries are going to experience a growth in human well-being, is they're going to be connected to electricity. Needless to say, everyone in Europe, everyone, including countries like Ukraine, pretty much everyone has access to electricity. So that's, and the same thing with much of the Middle East. Again, here, it's because there's people that are kind of semi-nomadic that live out in the desert. That's what you have there. But that tells you the difference. Yemen is much poor. Is an exception. Of course, there's Afghanistan and all of those problems. Asia, China. Now everyone has access to electricity. That's one of the big things that's happened in China. If you ever looked at, did I talk about this last week? I'm trying to think if I did. Have you ever looked at a picture of Korea, from satellite at night, and it's dark? There's no electricity. They don't have electricity, and that's Cambodia that's poverty. Vietnam, high access. Thailand and Malaysia, very high access to electricity. Here's what's going to be the big impact in the future. I think that was 80. See what that percentage is. 84.6. That's probably about 80. This is 80, probably 70s%, but that's probably also, they have access, but it may not be very high quality access. This country is going to dramatically expand its production of electricity. The access to electricity, the Prime Minister wants to dramatic expansion in the next 5 years. And one of the things that's going to come from that is that you have to generate electricity, and they're going to generate it with coal. So they're going to generate with coal, so that's going to have an impact on increased levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. Much of that, the increase in CO2 in the atmosphere in the next 20 years is going to come from, as this country dramatically increases the amount of electricity production. China has been the big increase in CO2 output in the world the last 20 years. Now India is going to, but it's because that's what you need to do to produce electricity. That's not surprising. That's not surprising. We can see the Central America, and again, you can see how different Haiti and how staggeringly poor that country is. South America, again, you can see these Andean countries, lower access. Your access to electricity, you can see that's a big measure. You can see that that's definitely correlated with GDP. And I think I've gone through everything there. We have a few, that's the material that I wanted to present to you today. Actually, I went through it faster than I expected. Let me, now, what I planned in the class was that, sometimes when you write down a date, I gave you till July the 1st for the midterm. I thought I was giving you till last week. And then I said, well, why didn't I thought I was waiting for your midterm assessment. I said, why didn't they turn it in? Nobody turned it in. And I thought, and then I went back and I checked and it said July the 1st. Because I did mean to. I meant last week and I looked at the wrong date on the calendar and went July 1st. So that means you had an extra week. But but that also means what I would hope. Let me just get this off because I just want to get the shut this down. Shut this down. To save the electricity. Hopefully I can get, because I still have the other class to teach and I can't get through the whole class. It's just unfortunate I wouldn't charge. I want you to really start focusing on your research. And if you can anybody can you just we have a few minutes. If you want, you can just ask me questions about what I'm looking for, what you're thinking about doing. Hopefully you've been working on, as part of writing your midterm, you've been thinking about that. So if you have some questions, please ask me now. As I say, we have a few minutes. Basically, what I'm looking for is about I want some research that you've done. Preferably that you make some use of data. I'd like you to make some use of data along with some of the things that I've introduced to you. Many of the students used national accounts. They made some use of national accounts data, and some of the students did some wonderful stuff. They did some wonderful, there was some wonderful work that came out of that. Used national accounts data. As I say, if you're interested in a particular country, it's really the first place to go, is that national accounts data. They used that. Some people looked at things, one of the topics, I had a student last year that did FDI, foreign direct investment. They studied that. One person studied Ireland and the financial crisis. Another person did Senegal. They did a very interesting study on Senegal. Another student studied Mongolia. A great little study on and again, most of these students use the national accounts data as the basis of their the basis. So they're getting the one of the things that's useful with the national accounts data, it gives you the basic story. It's like the basic story, and then you can find out information. For example, the student that did Mongolia last year, they did a very nice, they looked at the national accounts data. They were showing the FDI, they were showing foreign direct investment. They were showing that how you could see that in the national account flow. You could see the flow of the flow, and then they connected that with investment from China and specific in specific mining sectors in specific parts of the country. So I thought it was very well done, personally educational. I learned a lot from doing it. That. Another person looked at the Chinese exchange rate policy. That was very high level. Yuan, he was actually sat in on one class, but his level was very high. I wouldn't expect, that was much higher than I expected. But I thought studies like the Mongolia was very interesting. The Senegal was interesting because you could see the effect when you look at the data. You can see how the foreign investment, and particularly we know from France, the control that foreign investment has in that country, and you can see it in the data. So it's like you can see the data, and then you can go out and study. You can get other information, and I think it's a good way to connect the data with stories that maybe you get articles or other research, other things that people write, or other information. And then it makes the data come alive. And I think for when that information comes alive, then you really it's a very good way to learn a lot about a country or a part of the world. I had a student that did Brazil. One student did Brazil. That was quite interesting. Let's see. Did somebody do India? Not sure if they did India.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
When will we do presentation? When?
I think we'll do it after the last class. Now, one of the things I want to see is we're meeting later. We have to have a makeup class. So that's, it's 1 week after. So because we started late, because of the holiday, so we'll have to meet. So that's going to delay everything. So I would think the earliest would be the last class. The earliest would be the last class. I'll check exactly the date on that. But the earliest would be then, I think it's either the Monday, it's certainly no earlier than the Monday after the last week of class. So we're going to meet I believe the following week and have one more class. So I would think probably after that, let's say a week after that, I'll give you a little bit more time. But I think, so you'll have about 5 weeks. I think it should be a reasonable amount of time. But you'll need to make progress. From now on, you'll need to start focusing, get an idea, a country or an idea, an industry you were originally looking at the pearl industry. Have you chosen another sector?
Yes, I chose the crisis in Europe.
I'm sorry?
The crisis in Europe.
Okay.
Crisis.
Okay. The financial crisis? Okay. Any particular country or one of the? I mean, certainly there's. There's Greece, there's Italy, there's Spain, there's Ireland, there's Portugal. All have had very major problems related to that. I think it's important to understand the big picture. that you had problems in all those countries, but I think you might want to focus, I think that might be just too big a topic as a research project for the first semester. I think you might be, I think you might want to try to bring it down to one country. Is there any country that you're more interested in?
Maybe Greece.
Greece. Okay, I mean Greece is a classic problem. It's and it's fascinating to look at the data. You can see what Greece did was they borrowed a lot of other people's money and they spent it all. They borrowed it and they spent it and it's gone. And they didn't create wealth. It wasn't used to create wealth. They just spent it. They spent the money. And they borrowed it at they originally borrowed it at very low rates and they couldn't pay it back. It's also, Greece is a classic tale of, it's a story of how Germany dominates Europe. It's the domination that Germany pretends to be this well-meaning country that doesn't want to dominate its neighbors anymore. But the reality is that it does it in a different way. And so the story of German domination of Europe and the story of Greece is so there's a lot you can learn about by studying Greece. So I look forward to focus on that. I look forward to seeing what you have to say, and then we'll try to get you very quickly to focus on the important factors. And I would definitely recommend that you look at the national accounts data for Greece going back to 2000, at least 2001. Maybe 2003, I think, but no later, because the story of Greece, when Greece joined the euro, the Greeks went crazy with borrowing, and they started spending money like crazy, and the government lied to the people. They lied and said that you can have. They lied and lied and lied and they lied right up to when there was no money. The government still lied. When the money was all gone, they still lied and told them that everything was okay. And suddenly it was gone. And so when you look at the data, you can just see it all. The story is there in the national accounts data. It's a fascinating story. I assure you, you will learn, if you do that, you will learn a lot about how you can use national accounts data to tell the story. That's the thing, is that the national accounts data, when you look at it and you understand it, and you begin to see the story. And that's the thing, is if you become analysts, if for example you become analysts, or the ability to look at that data like that and tell a story is very powerful. That's very powerful, to be able to look at data and understand the story. Because one of the things that you'll learn, if you haven't learned already, you will learn in life that most journalists cannot know nothing about what they write about, and to be able to understand real data, and to be able to clearly understand it and explain to people is very powerful. That'll give you a tremendous power.
Thank you.